Despite claims by the president, we know with a certain degree of confidence that people aren't coming here by the busload to vote illegally in our elections. But we also know, according to the Secretary of State, that on occasion, people violate the spirit of the law by voting in New Hampshire with no real intention of staying in New Hampshire. So how serious is this problem? Is it a problem? Varying opinions on this for sure. I am joined by Senator Regina Birdsell, who is sponsoring a bill to toughen the standards in same-day registration, and Senator Donna Soucy, who is among those who think that this largely a Republican plot to suppress voters. But let's start with you, Senator. Good to see you both. We'll start there. But Senator Birdsell, tell us what your bill would do.
Josh, thank you for the question. But can I just take a few minutes to address, the Senate lost Senator Scott McGilvory this week very suddenly, and I just want to say that I know he affected a lot of lives, and he will be sorely missed in the Senate. And my thoughts and prayers are out there for his wife, his girls, and his extended family.
No question about it. Governor Sununu said it is a loss for New Hampshire. We certainly appreciate his public service, and our thoughts are with his family. Moving forward, obviously SB 3, though, a lot of people don't know what this does, so explain it to them.
Well, the first thing it does not do is it does not suppress any votes. It allows anyone to vote that is allowed to vote. What it does do is it is a trust but verify type of legislation. It says that if you want to come in and you want to vote and you check domicile in that town, then it's not just a state of mind, it needs to have an act and a verifiable act. So if you're going to come in and you're going to check off the domicile for that town, then we're asking that you either bring some proof with an address that you're living there.
Proof like a fishing license, a utility bill, just something more.
Driver's license, utility bill, cell phone bill, anything that shows that you have an intent to stay there and you have ties to the community. If you don't have it on same day, then you will be allowed to bring it back within 10 days. But you will still be able to vote. So again, there is no need, there's no suppression of the vote.
Okay, Senator Soucy, obviously you're in opposition to this bill. Why?
Sure. There are a few reasons, but first I want to just echo the comments that Regina made about Scott McGilvory. He was a dear friend and a valued colleague, and we are all going to miss him sorely. I don't believe the fraud issue is a real issue. And I think there are a couple other ways that we could deal with that issue. There are pieces of legislation being contemplated now to fund the Attorney General's office. If there really is fraud, there are laws on the books to prevent that already. If there really is a concern about fraud, we should use technology, e-poll books, a centralized voter checklist. Those things would immediately deal with the potential issue of fraud. Having said that, I think Regina has put a lot of hard work into this legislation, but I don't agree that the problem exists. And I believe that voters, although the intent is not to suppress them, I think the effect of this legislation in this long, detailed form, the provision of documents, and also the ability for election officials to visit your home if you haven't provided documents in a timely fashion, will dissuade and discourage some voters.
But why? I mean, you just said yourself that the AG needs to have more resources to investigate these types of things, and I guess that investigation would begin with someone coming to your home to make sure you live there.
Well, I think that's a bit invasive, and I think that we need to take people at their word. We have a process in place where people can sign an affidavit and swear under penalty of law that they do in fact live where they say. And the fact is, a lot of people, and particularly some of the people I represent, don't live neat, tidy lives, don't have a file cabinet at home with all of their documents. They have every intention of moving in with a significant other and staying there. Something goes wrong, could be a situation involving violence. They're not going to leave a paper trail of where they were. They're going to leave. They're not going to be able to produce documents from that individual saying they did live there at the time they voted. There's the potential for a lot of complications for people who are well-intentioned going in and who are exercising a constitutional right.
And Senator Soucy is not alone in the belief that the real problem lies within the AG's office not having enough resources to investigate potential problems under our current law.
Well, and that's true. And what we did a couple of weeks ago, we passed one of the Senate bills that allowed the AG's office to bring in an investigator. But what I would say is I listened to my constituents, and I also listened to the Secretary of State, who in fact did say that every election we have had at least one case of voter fraud prosecuted. So the intent of this bill is to try and reduce the amount of people that are coming in, you know, checking off the box and then leaving. We want to make sure that those individuals have, those who are voting there, have a stake in the outcome of that election. And in the last election, there were over 6,300 domicile letters that went out to verify. 428 have come back undeliverable. And since 2012, over 2,200 have come back undeliverable. So there's got to be what I'm trying to do is tighten up those that are coming back so that we can do some looking into the fact of voter fraud.
Senator Soucy, I mean, the residency issue was something that the Secretary of State was in favor of, saying you had to live here 10 days, 30 days, some sort of buffer. Is this about as best as compromise there could be if we're going to tighten up these laws, or do you think it's just, you know,
I think it tilts the scales towards dissuading some voters from exercising their constitutional right, and that concerns me. I also think it presents a potential problem for people who do have documents. The form that would be prescribed by the Secretary of State's office in Regina's legislation is extremely lengthy, very complicated, and someone reading that may see it and say, I don't know that I need to do this.
We live in the first in the nation primary state. We cherish it, and we're fortunate to have it. And the worst thing some people would say could happen is a national embarrassment and find out that we, you know, have been duped to a certain degree. Is that part of the equation?
I'm not concerned that we've been duped. As I said, if there is fraud, there are laws on the books currently to deal with that. I don't believe it's rampant. I certainly don't believe accusations of buses from Massachusetts or any of that. To the extent there's an errant person here and there who's doing something wrong, we can take care of that right now with our present system, and we can fortify that with some other pieces of legislation without doing this.
One of the things that I think about is, yes, we do not want anyone being pushed out of the polls for voting, but also we have to look at the fact that anyone who comes in and is illegally voting is actually diluting or taking the voting of someone who is legally domiciled in that town. So they're diluting the vote. For instance, that individual from Bernie Sanders' campaign, he used the Bernie Sanders campaign office as his domicile address. Whose vote did he dilute when he went out and voted? And now he's long gone. We have no way of getting him.
Let me ask you about students. We're almost out of time. A lot of people wonder, is this going to impact college students that come here for 4 years? Who knows where they're going to go after graduation?
Absolutely not. There's a provision in there that the same requirements as anyone else. If they can show proof that they are living in the dorm, they're able to vote. And if they get a cell phone bill, same thing. Come in and they vote same day.
Senator Soucy, I mean, obviously this is, Senator Jeff Woodburn, the minority leader, said that this is part of a national rhetoric that was started by the president to change the way the voters' laws have been discussed in the Neil Gorsuch confirmation hearings. Do you believe the current law can be improved?
I don't know that there's much we should do other than, as I said, increase resources for the Attorney General's office, but I also think the better use of technology would make a difference. It would make a difference right up front, and would also help the process for voters who are already registered to get in and out more quickly and advance the process. I don't cast aspersions on Regina, and I don't pretend that she has any particular motive other than to try to do what's right, and I think she's worked hard. I disagree with her solution, but you know, whether there's some grand scheme here,
And we'll end with that. Have you gotten pressure from outside of New Hampshire, from national parties to push this legislation?
Absolutely not. This is legislation that has been in the making since I was a state rep, going door to door and trying to listen to my constituents. So.
Okay. And this vote is happening this week in the Senate, this coming Thursday.
Correct.
All right, we'll see what happens. Thanks very much, Senators. Good to see you this morning.
Thank you.